everyone, and welcome to Open Book, a podcast of Roanoke City Public Schools. I'm Dr. Verlita White, the proud superintendent for Roanoke City Public Schools and your host for Open Book. On today's episode of the podcast, we're going to dig into a hot topic. And so that is the proposed change to how the city would provide funding to Roanoke City Public Schools. So as you may know, in Roanoke, our school board and our city council work closely together to ensure that RCPS receives the funding to provide every student with what they need to be successful. And since 2011, there's been a policy in place that provides 40% of most local tax revenue to support public education in Roanoke City. Currently, however, there is a proposal from the City Council to make a change to the funding policy. And today we want to make sure that our families and our community understand the nuances of this change. Joining us in this important discussion are Dr. Eli Jamison, Chair of the Roanoke City School Board. Welcome.
Thank you.
We also have the President of Roanoke City's Central Council PTA, Jessica Blandy, who is also an RCPS teacher and a parent. Welcome.
Thank you.
And we have Kathleen Jackson, our Chief Financial Officer for Roanoke City Public Schools. Welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So today I want us to unpack a few things. The details of the proposed change to the school funding policy. Also, I want to talk about why the policy was established and how it has benefited our students and families, and what the change would actually mean for our CPS and for everyone whom we serve. And so, again, I think people want to know, why is this so important? What is the policy? Why is this important? And why should people care about this? So, Dr. Jamison, I'll start with you about just a little history and background about the policy itself.
Sure. And thank you for having a podcast on this important subject. I think one of the things that I've done when we started this discussion is go back and talk to the people who helped create the policy in the first place so that I could better understand myself what was the impetus for all of this. And in essence, what our policy is in its simplest form is 40% of local tax revenues that the city receives minus a set of carve-outs, as the city has identified over the years very particular needs or very particular tax sources that they wanted excluded. That's no longer included in the tax revenues. But one of the reasons we started this policy is because at the time, every year, the council and the school boards, like many across the country, fought tooth and nail over every dollar. Every year, the school board had to go in and beg for their dollars and justify them, and it got very political and contentious. And neither the council nor the school board at that time thought that was a productive or helpful relationship. So what they did was sit down for, somewhere around 6 months, maybe longer, with just 2 school board members and 2 council members in a room with their budget experts, and really hammered out, what does it take to have a successful relationship between the two bodies, and what does it need to have a functional and healthy financial arrangement between the two bodies. And so the policy was born out of that conversation 14 years ago and has been functioning ever since. There were 2 carve-outs right from the very beginning, I believe. I'm looking at Mrs. Jackson, who has been on our work group as well as our chief financial officer, who can speak more to that. And then over the years, there's been certain other carve-outs that have been taken. We have certain commitments as a result of this policy. We have to pay back our debt service. We have to pay for our SROs. There are certain, when we said, no questions asked, you give us this money, they said, okay, but you will do this in the way of financial stewardship. And we said, okay, we can do that. And that's how it's been ever since, I think, as simply as I can.
So let's just talk about what the change is exactly, what the proposed change is. So Ms. Jackson, you want to talk about that a little bit? What are they proposing?
Sure. But as Dr. Jamison said, the current policy provides 40% of actual local tax revenue, minus some carve-outs, for public education. So what that means is that every year there is sort of a true-up action that happens at the end of the year to ensure that the school division does in fact receive 40% of actual revenue. So if revenue in a particular year ends up being a little bit less than what was budgeted, then we owe money back to the city. in most cases, because of course we are all careful with our budgeting and want to be a little conservative. No one has a crystal ball to know exactly what revenue is going to be in any given year. Fortunately, in most years, actual revenue ends up being a little bit more than what was budgeted. So as a result, that we receive 40% of whatever the difference is between what was budgeted and what actually was received by the city that year. So what is being considered by council is to do away with that year-end true up, and that would become more of an evaluation process whereby we would not automatically receive 40% of actual, but we would receive 40% of what was budgeted, and then anything that is above what was budgeted, we could go to council and request up to 40% of that year-end amount, and then it would be up to council whether or not they would choose to provide that.
And that's an important point. I think that people will ask me, for instance, they'll say, well, what's so wrong with that? What's wrong with the school board having to come and ask for the true up and to ask, for that, for those funds? What's what's wrong with that? And from my perspective as superintendent, I would say it really has to do with the confidence that we have in sharing the commitments and the promises that we make to the community. So, for instance, we know that we've used the true up, for instance, as a bit of a savings toward our capital projects. So Preston Park Elementary School, they're slated to have a new school, and that we're looking at making sure that we can keep that promise to them. We've been putting some money aside for that project, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, so again, those kinds of promises and commitments we've been able to make because of this partnership. And when we can't necessarily count on that, or we have to wait, then that makes it so that our promises are pending, if you will. So, Dr. Jamison, why don't you
if I can just,
as well?
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to add one other both example, and just to emphasize one of the things when I talk to people I'm realizing is that this word surplus has been used, but deficit has not been used with it, because yes, technically we may receive more revenue than expected, but the opposite also occasionally happens. And the thing that seems to confuse people is that we don't get 40% until the full budget is reconciled at the end of the year. So that's why it's always been called a true up. What is the true amount of money received? That's when the 40% formula kicks in. It's never kicked in at the budgetary stage. And just to put another example of how it's been really important, at least from my perspective as a board member, a couple of years ago, we knew that the revenues were coming in ahead of what we thought. We were sitting on teacher contracts to go out. As everybody may know, there's a teacher shortage. And we were able to get, with a raise included, teacher contracts pushed out really early. And because of that, for example, this year we started with only 9 teacher vacancies, which is unheard of right now in the United States, not just in Virginia.
Right. That's exactly right. And we talked about a lot of this at the last PTA meeting. Jessica and many of the PTA members really start to dig deeply into that 40% of the local tax revenue. So do you want to talk about what we talked about at the PTA meeting?
I first wanted to thank you guys for having me on here. It's just really important that the parents feel like they have a voice. It's been really refreshing to have an administration that listens to parents and includes parents on their committees. And I just want to thank you for letting me be here. It's definitely been a learning curve. There have been a lot of emails back and forth, and I know more about budgets than college ever taught me. And so I want to clarify, because I think I understand, but it gets really technical. And even when I'm explaining it to other people, I'm like, okay, this is how I understand it. So my first question is, we have commitments, I believe that's the word you use, that we pay back to the City of Roanoke. Is that correct?
Yeah, and this is such an important point, and I'll ask Mrs. Jackson if she'll kind of chime in here, but there are different percentages that people have heard. They hear 40%,
Yes.
they hear
Yes.
32%, they hear 28%, and they want to know, well, what is it, right? So which is it?
And as a parent, and quite frankly, as a taxpayer, that is very confusing.
Yeah,
It's
so-
very confusing.
That's a great question. So let's just take a minute to clarify that. What do we mean by 40%, 32%, 28%?
Sure.
What's the difference?
Yeah, that's an important question. So the funding formula does focus on local tax revenue. So when looking at the local share of funding for public education, just those local taxes, like our property taxes, real estate, that sort of thing, those are the taxes that the 40% formula is applied to.
Okay, so you're saying we get 40% of most of our local taxes. What percent of the actual City of Roanoke budget, that bottom line number, what percent does our school system get?
Yeah, I believe funding for schools is about 28% of the city's total budget. So
That's
yeah,
a big difference.
that's correct. So,
and-
some of those other sources are specific for other needs. So if you look at the whole thing, about 28% of the city's budget is for our public schools. And then sometimes we've talked about, as Dr. White mentioned, other percentages. I think it's important for the community to understand that of that 40%, that's part of what was agreed to in that formula, that there are certain other city functions that that funding has to pay for. So one of those is debt service on school construction projects.
So now you're speaking about, so we've got 28% of the total budget, correct?
Yes.
The bottom line number. Now you're getting into what we as a school system pay back to the City of Roanoke.
Yes.
So we get an actual invoice for this, is that right? For some of these?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Where we get an MOU that spells out what we owe back at the beginning of each year. Yes.
Okay.
So
And some of those kind of give backs, if you will, the paybacks include not only debt service, but also our school resource officers. Anything else that I'm missing?
Probably the biggest other area is related to social services. So there are some local costs for services that are arranged through the Children's Services Act. So that is partially funded by the state, but then there is a local share. So the school division is expected to pay that local share out of the funding for K-12 for students that are placed, for example, in private day services.
So when I read the Roanoke City Schools budget and I saw these line items that we pay back, that we committed to, I don't know. I don't know what it means. You know, it says local cost of Children's Services Act, funded service for students placed for services by the school system. That didn't mean a lot to me. So I wrote a couple emails, and then I did kind of a comparison with other school districts in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And I do notice that we pay the City of Roanoke back for our school resource officers. Do we have any say in hiring or managing them or anything?
No.
They're employees of the police or the sheriff's office.
Okay, so they're
They're
employees
not
of the
school
city,
employees.
but we do have to pay them.
Yes,
Or we
that's
do.
part
In
of
some
the
ways,
agreement.
that's our contribution to public safety,
Yeah.
aside from the fact that good schools also contributes to public safety in your community.
Okay, I'm going to come back to public safety because that was another question I had. But then the local cost of children's services, I emailed a bit with our surrounding school systems, and the school resource officers, that's a little bit over $1 million. And then the local cost of Children's Services Act, I found out was actually CASA, which at an elementary school level, I have not dealt a ton with that. I'm sure a guidance counselor would know more. But that's a little over $3 million. And that's also not typically, that's typically in almost all the other school districts I spoke to in Virginia, that's typically not paid for. So it's a little unusual for us to pay back for the school resource officers and for the Child Services Act. But what I hear you saying is that we've agreed to that commitment because we feel like it it goes right into school safety and other things.
One of the things that people craft when the original people crafted this policy was part of the what made this fiscally sound for both bodies was, all right, we will give you this no fuss in some ways money, but in return you need to be able to take care of some of these other things. So that was the trade-off at the time.
But looking back at that original document, there were only 2 of these trade-offs or 2 commitments. School resource officers was not on there, and neither was the CASA Act. I believe I saw debt services and stormwater fees.
Correct.
So those have actually been added. Is that correct? In the past years, since the 2011 budget?
I believe that's true. Yes, when you look at the dates of addition on the policy, those are some of the things that were added in subsequent years.
Okay, and then I don't want to be a microphone hog, but I did feel like as a parent,
no, these are good questions.
Well,
Good questions.
You know, what is on, well, I'll wear both hats for this one. As a teacher, what is my number one priority? It's not what you think I'm going to say, because what you think I'm going to say is education, and that is right up there. But when the kids come into my school, those are my school kids. And if anybody's listening has had a kid in my class, they know that. Like, I'm their school mom. And I, as a mother, have to give that control over to my daughter's teachers. So school safety is at the top of everybody's mind right now. And let me clarify, I don't have any hesitations. I believe that Roanoke City Schools is really doing their diligence, and that's part of the way I know they're good stewards of money, because I see the improvements in school, both on the teacher end and as the parent end. But if we're talking about having to campaign, if you will, for funds at the end of the year, that has the possibility every year of our 28% being lower and lower. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. I mean, it becomes unstable because it always has the potential to ultimately be a lower percent.
Is it fair to say right now our funding is stable for the school system, and if this passes, our funding will be unstable?
I'm looking at...
has the possibility of being unstable.
Right. I think as I look at Ms. Jackson, I'm also thinking what I'd like to say is predictable, which to me provides this stability, right?
And I might say less stable.
And less stable. Less stable.
Okay.
Yes, it's predictable in its current form, and that is incredibly valuable when you're managing a budget the size of our budget, to be able to have... I mean, one of the things that we tend to know as a school board is by February of every year, we know a number for the next year. We also know if we're on target, if the city is on target. They give us predictions all along of, are we going to be on budget? Are we going to be a little over budget? Are we going to be a little under budget? And Mrs. Jackson's office is constantly on top of that from about February through June of every year to make sure we close the gap based on the city's predictions.
So...
If I could just add real quick, I mean, we have a great working relationship with the finance office in the city. And so, as Dr. Jameson mentioned, we are in good communication about where things stand. So that's very helpful to know, as much as we try to have an exact budget, no one can predict what's going to come. So it is not unheard of for something to come to light in the middle of a year that, oh gosh, this is something we really want to be able to move forward with. So those kinds of conversations are very helpful if we're hearing, okay, well, it's looking like revenue is going to be a little bit better than budget this year. So then we have the confidence to say, okay, we can move forward now rather than waiting and saying, oh, not sure if we've got the money for that. And when we need something, we can move forward. Or if the opposite happens, to know, okay, now we can take action sooner rather than later if we need to hold off on some things if revenue is not meeting expectations.
So I'll just jump in there and give an example of when of what you're saying, and getting back to your point about safety. So for instance, when we had a series of threats a couple of years ago, and we had our safety summit, and from that, we took to the school board 25 safety enhancements and recommendations for school board approval. We used our true up at that point. Correct me if I'm wrong, right? We used our true up and some other operating dollars to put in those safety enhancements, correct?
That's correct. Yes, that was sort of right at the beginning of the school year, so it was after the budget had already been approved, but we had that information and knew we had those additional dollars that we could count on so that we could move forward with those efforts and not have to wait.
So there are so many safety enhancements that we were able to make midstream, really mid-year, 25 safety enhancements and improvements that we didn't know going into that school year that we were going to need. But because of the threats and those things that were happening, we were able to use the true up and other operating dollars to make promises and commitments to our families. And you can see those. You can see those promises and commitments that have been fulfilled. You see at Hurt Park, for instance, you see a new double entry system that we were able to do, and other kinds of video systems and cameras and other safety enhancements that the school board approved. In order to make those safety enhancements a reality, we were able to use that funding.
And Dr. White, if I could just quickly interrupt to
Sure.
put it out there, as a parent, if there have been threats, if there has been a tense situation, the last thing I want to hear somebody say to me is, those are great ideas for safety, but you're going to have to wait 2 years so we can find money in the budget. So the ability for you to have been able to come up with 25 bullet points to be funded, and you were able to do that mid-year, as a parent, that is the kind of reassurance I need in public schools today.
Well, and what I'd like to say to that, Jessica, I think that's really important. What you're hearing also, for me as a board member, is the ability to move strategically. So this division has had for a long time a commitment to ongoing safety in all kinds of ways: emotional, physical, psychological. All of the safety elements are part of our strategic plan, are part of our strategic commitments to our children. So being able, that's why you see us use our money in such visual ways, because these plans are always sitting there. And when we have the money coming, and if it's additional, then if it's a little bit over expected, we want to be able to move quickly on the things that are most important to our children and families.
I just keep going back to it's about keeping our promises and then acting on in the immediate. Just like you said, there are things that we can't wait on. There are things that it's like safety measures. We can't wait on those things. And other things where we've made promises and commitments, we included the entire community on our strategic plan, for instance, and we've been able to make good on those promises, be it from curriculum to construction, right? I always say from instruction to construction, we've been able to make good on those promises. I do worry about a budget that is less stable and whether or not we'll be able to fulfill those commitments moving forward.
Well, and one thing that I will say, in my major at Virginia Tech, I did not get a lot of budget instruction, but I did get a lot of research instruction. So one thing my board and I did is, what's the precedent for this? What are the numbers? I like a good fact. And so there are 2 peer-based research studies out. One's by Northwestern. The one by Northwestern University that came out in 2017. So we all know 2017, that was literally a whole world away. But the facts that came out of this, and this is easily accessible, I can also post it to our Facebook RCC PTA page. When school spending rose a total of 10% across all 12 years of public school, graduation rates increased 7%. Students exposed to this spending, so this is my kid right now in the school system, had 7% higher wages as adults and a 3% point lower risk of adult poverty. I'm going to flip over to the University of Michigan. We said that one was in 2017. This is in 2022. So this is very recent research. Tracking the outcomes of these 2 groups of students. This is a lesser funded school system versus one with more stable funding. Students who attended better funded elementary schools were taught by teachers with greater experience and earning higher salaries, which as a teacher, I can tell you, we are top of the pay grade in Roanoke City. Smaller size classes, and attended schools with a larger number of administrators such as vice principals. I can also tell you, wearing my teacher hat, that all of your elementary schools have vice principals now, and that wasn't the case before. That was one of the safety measures. We shared one with a school of a similar size. Now we have one that's there full time. And if there's a situation where neither principal can be there, we have the ability to borrow a principal from another school or even somebody from central office. Students who attended better funded schools were 15% less likely to be arrested through age 30. I could go on, but I'm going to stop right there. That's why our relationship with the Roanoke Police Department, the Sheriff's Office, has been so strong. That's why our firefighters jump at the chance to do community outreach for us, because they know that when we fund a Roanoke City student, we are funding a future Roanoke City citizen.
If you don't mind, one thing that I think people don't think about when they think about schools is this side, which is something we think about a lot. We're the 5th largest employer in the region.
Indeed.
Correct.
We employ over 2,200 people. The money that we get goes to people. As Dr. White often says, we are in a people business, from students to our families to our employees. We are a people business. Our money goes to people, which goes into our economy, which goes into our future.
And we want those complementary services, right? We're not competing. We're not competing with city or city services. We serve the same community. We serve the same city. And so we want to make sure that our services are complementary. And so before we end, I do want to remind everyone of what's coming up and when the City Council is expected to take up this issue. And I believe that's Monday, the 13th.
Yeah, I was going to share just a couple ways you can get involved.
Great.
And let me preface this by saying, except for college, I have always lived in the city of Roanoke. I graduated here, and I'm choosing to raise my family here in the same school system that I graduated from. With that to be said, this whole balanced budget, this whole funding formula, there's not a part of me that thinks that the city of Roanoke wants to be at odds with anybody. That as a parent, as a taxpayer, that's not how I feel. I feel like they listen to us. And so as a parent, as a taxpayer, you can throw in as a teacher too, I encourage you, just email them. There is a meeting on Monday, May 13th at 2 p.m. You can speak there and just kind of say, hey, listen, I'm a parent and I want to continue stable school funding. If you could consider not passing these changes. If speaking in public is not your jam, I see you, I feel you. You can also email them. Every individual constituent is on RoanokeVA.gov. That's the website, and then you can look up their email addresses. I know that they listen to us. Some of them graduated from this school district. Some of them have children in this school district right now. And I think this is the perfect opportunity to advocate for our students and our children, but also to continue this amazing relationship we've had and the ease and the lack of tension when it comes to funding. They just need to hear us tell them. So I encourage you, speak if you can. Monday, May 13th, 2 p.m. You sign up through that very same link, RoanokeVA.gov, or just make a phone call. Or if you're like me and you dread making phone calls, just send an email. They're all powerful and they are all being listened to. I do believe our city of Roanoke listens to the taxpayers and the citizens.
I think so. And if I could, before I just last thing is what we are seeing. If you look at Roanoke City Public Schools, I'm very proud of the work that's done here. I love this city. I'm very proud of the city. We all want investments in our city to be successful for now and into the future. What you're seeing in success in Roanoke City Public Schools is an outcome of 14 years of a funding formula and stability over time. This didn't happen overnight. What I want to be able to say 14 years from now, looking back, is that we showed the same wisdom that the people who created the policy initially demonstrated. Public schools are never fully funded. There's so much more we could do, but we are proud of where we've come, and we see a future that depends on stable funding, and that's what makes it so important for our children.
Wonderful. And Dr. Jamison, I think we'll let your word be the final word on that. And I just want to say to you, Dr. Jamison, Mrs. Blandy, Mrs. Jackson, just thank you so much for joining me here today for this really important conversation about our schools, our school funding, our school system, and how we support our children. Ultimately, that's what we're talking about, how we support our children and how we continue a stable funding formula for the benefit of our students. So as a reminder, you can subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, or YouTube, and you can also listen to this on the RCPS website. So again, I'm Dr. Verlita White, Superintendent of Roanoke City Public Schools, and your host of Open Book. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next month.